In the world of modern warfare, we are constantly reminded of the impressive level of technical development that has taken place over the last 4 or 5 decades. Our newsfeed is populated by reports from conflicts around the world where the roles of both attack and defense are principally performed by digital-level weapons like guided missiles, computer-assisted attack aircraft, submarines, and remotely controlled drones. But for the majority of the 20th century, sea power was as important, if not in many instances more important, than superiority on the land and in the air. Supply routes could be blockaded by naval vessels, severely restricting a nation's ability to wage war. The bombardment of defensive positions could be extremely effective. During the Second World War in particular, naval actions were often pivotal in deciding ultimate victory. Never was this more true than in the case of the war in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. Even as the role of the aircraft carrier became ever more dominant, the protection and effectiveness of the flat tops still relied heavily on the firepower of the frigates, destroyers, and battleships within any task force. The biggest, most high-profile, and most glamorous of these has undisputably been the battleship. Never has this been more clearly demonstrated than during World War II in the Atlantic theatre of war, where more shipping was sunk than anywhere else. For a moment, during 1941, 6 months before the United States entered the war, the world held its breath as Germany put to sea in next-level battleships, Bismarck and Tirpitz. So, given the legacy and dominance of the British Navy, how did the Third Reich do it? To understand that, we need to go back to Germany's surrender at the end of World War I and the subsequent signing of the Versailles Treaty. This treaty was an agreement between nations as to how post-Great War Europe would be established and how Germany would pay for its transgressions. In military terms, the treaty was intended to render Germany incapable of offensive action by allowing an army of no more than 100,000 troops, and the general staff was to be dissolved. Conscription was abolished, and even the police force was reduced to its pre-war size. All fortifications were to be demolished, and new construction was forbidden. Germany was prohibited from the arms trade. Article 198 of the treaty even prohibited Germany from having an air force of any kind. The German Navy was allowed only 36 surface vessels and was forbidden to include any submarines at all. Controversially, Germany was made to accept sole responsibility for all the loss and damage caused by the First World War. This was to result in monetary reparations of 132 billion gold marks to be paid. That's roughly equivalent to 442 billion US dollars in today's money. The Versailles Treaty also stripped Germany of 25,000 square miles of territory and forced it to accept the independence of both Czechoslovakia and Poland. Germany was plunged into depression. Rampant hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and a large drop in living standards plagued the country month after month. Slowly and surely, Germany's resentment grew to gigantic proportions. This is perhaps the key mandate of the Nazi Party on which Adolf Hitler's rise to power was based. In addition, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed during 1922 among the major allies of World War I. It limited the construction of battleships, and other classes of ships were limited to 10,000 tons of displacement each. More limitations of warship building were added in 1930 and then again in 1936, causing both Japan and Italy to then renounce the treaty. And Adolf Hitler's new Germany wasted no time in taking the opportunity to renounce the Treaty of Versailles in complete belligerence of all the other world powers. This is the crucial point in the timeline where the Nazis began the rebuilding of their armed forces. Under the newly established Nazi regime, Germany began a massive program of expansion. As a prelude towards its goals, the Rhineland was remilitarized in March of 1936. And our story of Bismarck and Tirpitz begins. In the early morning of the 1st of September 1939, German battleship Schleswig-Holstein fired at the Polish land-based garrison on the Westerplatte Peninsula in the harbour of the Polish free city of Danzig, now known as Gdansk. The coming months would see high-profile German naval activity across Europe and beyond, involving monstrous Nazi battleships like the Eisenhower and the Scharnhorst, as well as heavy cruisers like the Admiral Hipper, the Prinz Eugen, and the Blücher. But that was a different story. This is a story of German sea power, taking place in the Second World War. It is the story of Hitler's Third Reich, its bid for superiority on the high seas, and the success and failure of its most feared seafaring superweapons. The battleships Bismarck and sister ship Tirpitz. The cold, hard, grey nature of these particular stories ironically mimics the nature of the vessels themselves, both ending in shattered steel and in shattered dreams of Nazi victory. The Bismarck's tour of duty seems unusually short, starting and ending inside of just 1 month, the focus of which is her offensive operational duty of just 11 days. However, as with so many single operations in so many wars, that despite the short length, abrupt nature, and intense drama of this particular sea battle, The events that took place in the North Atlantic between the 16th and 27th of May 1941 would be absolutely critical for the future of both the soon-to-be Allies and Axis powers, and leave behind an inspiring, intriguing, and terrifying story that would endure beyond the war and even into the next century. The Tirpitz, every bit as deadly, powerful, and technologically advanced as Bismarck, had a longer lifespan of just over 3 years. But in nature, her story is, by comparison, far less dramatic and impactful than that of her infamous sibling. Nevertheless, Tirpitz presented a serious threat to Allied shipping for much of the war, before her lights were snuffed out in the freezing landscape of the Norwegian fjords. But the story of the most powerful World War II battleships afloat begins 5 years before, in July and November of 1936, at the Blommenvoss shipyard in Hamburg, where the keels of both battleships were laid. It took 4 years, over 200,000 tons of steel, and over 4 million rivets before each ship, minus its superstructure and armaments, splashed into the waters of the River Elbe in 1940, under the gleeful gaze of the Führer. The cost of building Bismarck was 196 million Reichsmarks, whilst Tirpitz was slightly cheaper at 191.6 million Reichsmarks. That's about $1.6 billion for each battleship in today's money. These sea-going monsters, each measuring almost 250 meters in length, were named for prominent historical military heroes. The Bismarck was named for German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor provoked 3 short but decisive wars against Denmark, Austria, and France during his tenure, and was widely recognized and respected for his lifetime of duty and service to his country. The Tirpitz was honored with the name of German Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, famed for taking the then modest Imperial German Navy and turning it into a world-class force that could threaten Britain's Royal Navy. After fitting, equipping, and arming, Bismarck conducted sea trials and, being ready for sea in all respects, brought the ship's complement up to an impressive 2,221 before heading out into open waters for her very first operation at 0200 hours on the 19th of May 1941. Operation Rhino, designed to blockade Allied shipping in the Atlantic, produced a cold sweat of reaction all the way through the Admiralty, directly to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's office in Downing Street, London. And with good reason. The Royal Navy knew it was now facing the fastest and most powerful battleships ever made in the European theatre of naval war. Bismarck and Tirpitz each sported 8 deadly 15-inch main guns set in 4 turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These matched the main armaments found in British battleships like HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales, also armed with 15 and 14-inch guns respectively. but the Germans boasted a firing rate for their main armament of 1 salvo every 18 seconds, as opposed to the British reload rate of around every 40 seconds. And the Bismarck's secondary gun turrets massively outnumbered the British ships, giving them a huge advantage at close quarters. German protective armour generally outranked the Royal Navy, with Bismarck's batteries and crew sitting pretty behind 14 inches of steel plating. Bristling with state-of-the-art weaponry and technology, Bismarck slipped out into the Atlantic from its Norwegian hiding place, accompanied by German heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. This prestigious escort brought a further 40 powerful guns to the party. Operation Rhino was masterminded by hero of the German people, Admiral Erich Raeder. But travelling on board the mighty Bismarck that day were no less than Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the task force, and noted Captain Ernst Lindemann, commanding the Bismarck herself. Neither would return from the approaching conflict that turned the tide of German sea power for the remainder of the war. The British Royal Navy first learned of Bismarck's sortie after the Swedish cruiser Gotland spotted German battleships passing through the western Baltic Sea on 20th of May. Gotland's report was then passed to the British Naval Attaché in Stockholm, who in turn forwarded it to the Admiralty in England. British reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the Germans' presence in Norway. Now alerted that major German warships were at sea, with the intention of breaking out into the Atlantic, the Royal Navy began to dispatch vessels to patrol the likely routes. The heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and Suffolk covered the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. Another group, consisting of the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Hood, cruised to the south of Iceland. The British played an excruciating waiting game, not knowing where the monstrous pair would emerge. And so the seas across the 4 possible routes were constantly monitored. HMS Norfolk and Suffolk spotted Bismarck and Prinz Eugen on the evening of the 23rd of May, and continued shadowing the Germans throughout the night along the line of the Greenland ice pack, whilst remaining just outside of German gun range. Just before 0300, Vice Admiral Holland signals his battle group to go to battle stations and steer towards the German ships at an increased speed of 28 knots. At 05:35, lookouts on the Prince of Wales got a visual sighting of the German ships. Then, together with the unsinkable British battlecruiser Hood, they moved to attack. The Hood opened fire first at 05:52. Both British ships were at a disadvantage due to the angle of their arrival, which severely restricted the number of guns they could bring to bear. More confusion was added to the mix when the initial salvos were aimed at Prince Eugen rather than the Bismarck. During these first British volleys, the Bismarck was hit 3 times, causing some damage and flooding. But just 3 minutes later, Captain Lindemann bellowed to his bridge crew, "I'm not letting my ship get shot out from under my arse. Open fire." And at 05:55, both German warships rained down destruction on the British task force. A salvo of Nazi shells straddled the Hood. And quite suddenly, the Royal Navy's former flagship literally blew apart, peppering Prince of Wales with steel splinters 5 miles distant. Of her full crew complement of over 1,400 souls, only 3 survived. Nursing several shell hits, Prince of Wales belched out a massive smokescreen and retreated, leaving the German battle group, the Führer, and the German nation elated at this early and devastating victory. After the exchange, Lütjens refused to allow Lindemann to give chase in order to sink Prince of Wales, and instead ordered a course due west. His orders were clear. Attacking convoys was his priority, as well as taking on seawater. Bismarck was leaking fuel oil. Lütjens ordered Prince Eugen to drop back and see how much of a trail she was leaving astern. The carpet of oil was broad enough to cover both sides of the ship's wake. Disregarding Lindemann's subsequent recommendation to return to Bergen, Lütjens ordered Bismarck to head for the French port of Saint-Nazaire, as well as ordering the undamaged Prince Eugen to leave Bismarck and sail south to continue raiding on her own. Back in Britain, the public was shocked by the news. Churchill responded with a direct and unambiguous message to the Admiralty.
And now, our first Sea Lord, I want to make it unmistakably clear that there is absolutely nothing as vital to the nation at this moment as the destruction of the Bismarck. You are authorized to employ any means at your disposal, regardless of risk, and regardless of the price that must be paid. This is a battle we cannot afford to lose. I don't care how you do it, you must sink the Bismarck. Good luck to you.
The Admiralty then issued urgent orders that every available warship in the Atlantic was to be immediately mobilized to hunt down and destroy Bismarck. But in the early hours of May 25th, the Bismarck was nowhere to be seen. The Royal Navy had lost all sight of her. Later that same day, Admiral Lütjens, apparently oblivious that he had lost his pursuers, broke radio silence to send a coded message to Germany. This allowed the British to triangulate the approximate position of the Bismarck, and aircraft were immediately dispatched to hunt for the German battleship. After many long and tension-filled hours, Bismarck was finally rediscovered late in the morning on the 26th of May by an RAF Catalina flying boat from No. 209 Squadron. At dusk that evening, Fairey Swordfish aircraft launched from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal carried out an audacious attack. The first wave of planes mistakenly targeted HMS Sheffield. Due to a technical fault with the torpedoes, no damage was done and the fault was corrected for subsequent attacks. The Fairey Swordfish is a biplane torpedo bomber, more akin to the famous wood and paper aircraft of the First World War than its new contemporary cousins like the Mosquito and Beaufighter. Originating in the early 1930s, the Swordfish, nicknamed Stringbag, was principally operated by the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy. It was initially operated as a fleet attack aircraft. During its later years, the Swordfish was increasingly used as an anti-submarine and training platform. The type that attacked the Bismarck was in frontline service throughout the Second World War, achieving some spectacular successes. In actual fact, Fairey Swordfish aircraft sank a greater tonnage of Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft during the war, and remained in frontline service until VE Day, having outlived some of the aircraft intended to replace it. It must, at the time, have seemed almost incredible to send such frail and dated weapons to fight a tough and capable enemy like Bismarck. Added to which, the Mark 12 torpedoes, with which they were armed, were relatively crude and unreliable, being fitted with a wooden stabilizer and first magnetic and then contact warheads. These torpedoes often suffered from a variety of technical problems which prevented them from reaching their target at all. For all of these reasons, precious attack time was lost on the 26th of May, but despite the lateness of the day, it was decided to try another airborne assault. A second attack wave of Swordfish took off in near darkness at around 2100 hours. Once again, the torpedo bombers found Bismarck with their ASV-2 radars. And this time, a hit by a single torpedo jammed Bismarck's rudder and steering gear at an angle of 12 degrees to port. This resulted in her being able to steam only in one large circle. Repair efforts by the crew to free the rudder failed. Bismarck attempted to steer by alternating the power of her 3 propeller shafts, which, in the prevailing force-8 winds and sea state, actually resulted in the ship being forced to sail towards British battleships King George V and Rodney. At 23:40 hours on the 26th of May 1941, Admiral Lütjens, realizing the impossible odds he now faced, delivered to Group West, the German command base, the signal, "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." Now, only the end remained. At 08:43, on the morning of Tuesday the 27th of May. Lookouts on the King George V spotted Bismarck some 25,000 yards away. Rodney opened fire first at 0847, followed quickly by King George V. Bismarck was unable to steer due to the torpedo damage. The resulting unpredictable motions made the ship a very unstable gun platform and created a hugely difficult gunnery problem, with the crews being unable to properly target the enemy. Bismarck, however, returned fire at 0850 with her forward guns, and with her second salvo, she straddled Rodney. This was the closest she came to scoring a hit on any British warship in the final engagement, because at 0902, a salvo of 16-inch shells from HMS Rodney struck the Bismarck's forward superstructure, damaging the bridge and the main fire control, killing most of the senior officers instantly. The salvo also damaged the forward main battery gun turrets. The aft fire control station took over direction of the aft turrets, but after another 3 salvos, it too was also knocked out. With both fire control positions out of action, Bismarck's shooting became increasingly erratic, allowing the British ships to close the range. British heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and Dorsetshire also closed in and began firing with their deadly 8-inch secondary armament. At around 0931, the last of Bismarck's 4 main battery turrets was put out of action. First Officer Hans Eulers, the surviving senior German officer, then issued the order to scuttle the Bismarck. For all the watertight doors to be opened, for the engine room personnel to prepare demolition charges, and for the crew to abandon ship. Eulers moved through the ship, repeating these orders to all he met, until he too was killed. The surviving senior engineer officer ordered his men to set the explosive charges with a 9-minute fuse. The intercom system was then blown away, so he sent a messenger to make his way through the ship and confirm the order to scuttle. But when the messenger never returned, UNAC primed the charges and ordered the engineering crew to abandon ship. Once all 4 of Bismarck's main battery turrets were out of action at around 0931, HMS Rodney closed to around 3,000 yards with orders to fire her guns at point-blank range into Bismarck's superstructure. King George V remained at a greater distance and continued to fire her guns to increase the possibility that her shells would strike Bismarck's decks. During this period, HMS Rodney also launched 21-inch deck-mounted torpedoes at the Bismarck, claiming 1 hit. By 1000 hours, the 2 battleships had reduced Bismarck's superstructure and decks to a shambles. Aflame from stem to stern, although the Germans still refused to surrender. The Bismarck was now settling by the stern due to uncontrolled flooding and had taken on a 20-degree list to port. The British battleships were running low on fuel, so at 10:20, Dorsetshire was ordered to close and torpedo the crippled Bismarck, while King George V and the Rodney turned for port. HMS Dorsetshire fired a pair of torpedoes into Bismarck's starboard side, and then moved around to her port side and fired yet more torpedoes into the dying metal monster. Finally, and only after having some 2,800 British shells and torpedoes fired at it, the greatest European battleship ever to sail, the most feared and revered warship afloat, began, at last, to turn over, fully capsizing at around 10:35. And by 10:40, she had slipped unceremoniously, stern first, beneath the freezing grey waves of the Atlantic, taking with her Hitler's dreams of Nazi victory and domination on the high seas. Afterwards, British ships rescued just 111 Bismarck survivors. The Tirpitz and her sister ship Bismarck were the largest battleships ever built by Germany, and also two of the largest built by any European power. Tirpitz was also built for Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine prior to and during the Second World War. The ship was laid down at the Kriegsmarine Werft at Wilhelmshaven on November 1936, and her hull was launched 2.5 years later. Work was completed in February 1941, and when she was commissioned into the German fleet, Tirpitz was also armed with a main battery of 8 15-inch guns mounted in 4 twin turrets. But after a series of wartime modifications, she was actually 2,000 tons heavier than Bismarck, making her the heaviest battleship ever built by a European navy. After completing sea trials in spring 1941, Tirpitz briefly served as the centerpiece of Germany's Baltic Fleet. After the naval humiliation that followed the sinking of the Bismarck in May, Adolf Hitler, a self-confessed amateur of naval strategic warfare, was reluctant to commit his remaining steel terror to serious combat. Most likely, it seems, he wanted to avoid another embarrassing defeat and subsequently another fatalistic world news headline. In early 1942, Tirpitz sailed to Norway to act as a deterrent against Allied invasion. Tirpitz was also intended to be used to intercept Allied convoys to the Soviet Union, and 2 such missions were attempted in 1942. At this point in the war, deterrent was really the only feasible role for her, since the Saint-Nazaire raid had made operations against the Atlantic convoy lanes too risky. So the Germans' last great battleship Tirpitz left Wilhelmshaven at 2300 hours on the 14th of January 1942 and made for Trondheim in southern Norway. After which, escorted by 4 destroyers, she was moved to the Fightenfjord. There she was moored next to a cliff which protected the ship from air attacks. The ship's crew cut down trees and placed them aboard Tirpitz, also to camouflage her from prying eyes. The crew frequently hid the entire ship inside a cloud of artificial fog created using water and chlorosulfuric acid. Additional anti-aircraft batteries were installed around the fjord, as were anti-torpedo nets and heavy booms in the entrance to the anchorage. Tirpitz became known as the Lonely Queen of the North because she was so rarely deployed, and life for her crew became a series of long and monotonous waits. Frequent fuel shortages curtailed training and kept the battleship and her escorts moored behind their protective netting. Tirpitz effectively acted as a fleet in being, forcing the British Royal Navy to retain significant naval forces in the area to contain the battleship. Despite all this, she was still involved in a small number of local sorties, and despite being attacked by Russian submarines, she even managed to successfully target Allied supply ships in her area. But she never really made her mark as the predator she was intended to be. In September 1943, Tirpitz, along with the battleship Scharnhorst, bombarded Allied positions in Spitsbergen. This was the only time the ship used her main battery in an offensive role. Never forgetting the threat created by her sister ship Bismarck, Allied forces never gave up trying to knock her out, attacking her in all of the various Norwegian fjords in which she was hidden. Operations Source, Tungsten, Planet, Brawn, Tiger Claw, Mascot, Goodwood, Paravane, and Obviate all missed their mark, employing ships, mini-submarines, bombers, fighter bombers, and underwater mines to try and destroy the German behemoth. In the 2.5 years she was stationed in Norway, there were no less than 20 British operations aimed at sinking Tirpitz. But it was not until November the 12th, 1944, that Operation Catechism finally ended the lonely Queen of the North's reign. A force of 32 Lancasters from numbers 9 and 617 squadrons dropped 29 tallboy bombs on the ship. Tallboy bombs, dubbed earthquake bombs, were developed by Barnes-Wallis, designer of the famous bouncing bomb, and were specially designed to attack such difficult targets. They packed a mighty punch, delivering over 5,000 pounds of high explosive per unit. They were dropped by specially adapted Avro Lancaster bomber aircraft from an altitude of around 18,000 feet. Hitting the target at 750 miles per hour and leaving a crater 80 feet deep and 100 feet across. The Catechism bomber raid scored hits on the anti-torpedo nets and barriers protecting Tirpitz, and they caused significant cratering of the seabed, removing much of the sandbank constructed to prevent the ship from capsizing. 2 bombs scored direct hits on the Tirpitz, 1 penetrated the ship's deck between turrets, failing to explode. But the second hit amidships, between the aircraft catapult and the funnel, caused severe damage. A very large hole was blown in the ship's side and bottom. The entire section of belt armor around the bomb was completely destroyed. As a result, significant flooding increased the ship's list to port. It then increased further, at which point the captain then issued the order to abandon ship. At 09:58, a large explosion rocked the battleship. A gun turret roof and part of the rotating structure were thrown 82 feet into the air, onto a group of men swimming to the shore, crushing them to death. Tirpitz rapidly rolled over and buried her superstructure in the sea floor. And there she lay, dead and forlorn for all to see. In the aftermath of the attack, 82 men trapped in the upturned hull were rescued by cutting through the exposed bottom of the ship. But the total loss of life is estimated at around 1,100 out of a full complement of over 2,000 officers and enlisted men. Between 1948 and 1957, the wreck of the Tirpitz was broken up and largely sold for scrap by a joint Norwegian and German salvage operation. But it was not the last time we would hear from the Tirpitz's infamous sister ship Bismarck. In June 1989, the wreck of Germany's most famous powerful fast battleship was located by Robert Ballard, who also located the wreck of the RMS Titanic. Bismarck was found to be resting on her keel at a depth of approximately 16,000 feet. Ballard points out that the hull is in relatively good condition. He states simply that Bismarck did not explode. Ballard added, "We found a hull that appears whole and relatively undamaged by the descent and impact. This suggests that Bismarck's compartments were flooded when the ship sank." They concluded that the direct cause of sinking was scuttling, the crew's deliberate sabotage of engine room valves as claimed by German survivors. Could it be that the world's most infamous battleship never was defeated by naval gunnery and torpedo attacks? And even in that final moment, at 10:40 on the morning of Tuesday the 27th of May 1941, she took her own life rather than be captured, leaving an undying legacy above her final resting place in the cold and unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic.